my mic on now?
Yeah.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so we're talking about the thyroid glands, and we're talking about these follicles, which are colloids surrounded by these follicular cells. So in order to make our thyroid hormones, we need thyroglobulin, which is our precursor, and it's a protein. And we're going to need iodide, which is just iodine ions, basically. So we get iodine from our food, from any vitamins we take. We actively transport that iodine into the colloid, so into the thyroid gland. So when it comes time to start making our thyroid hormones, we have a pathway. I'm not going to ask you to memorize this whole pathway, but I want you to get the general idea. So what we see happening here is here's our thyroglobulin. Right? So this is our precursor molecule. Our first step here is to add on our iodide ions. And so we can see that we're adding on these little iodine ions, and we're getting these kind of like little side chains. So this is with some iodine added, this DIT and this MIT. We don't need to worry about specifically what they are, but that's when we add the iodine on, and that gives us our T3 and our T4, which are our two thyroid hormones, bound together. Okay. So now that we have our T3 and T4 bound together, made from this thyroglobulin, we're going to pull that out of the colloid and into the follicular cell, so into that edge of the follicle. Okay. Now, once we do that, we need to have some kind of a signal that tells us it's actually time to release those thyroid hormones before we actually move anything into the bloodstream. So we jump all the way over here to our TSH receptor. So TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone. So it's coming from what part of the body? Yep, yeah, that's one of our anterior pituitary hormones. So we have our thyroid stimulating hormone, which is produced by the anterior pituitary in response to thyroid releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. And that binds into a receptor, which starts the second messenger pathway. So we can see our old friend cyclic A&P is involved here. And this pathway ultimately tells us that we need to break apart this thyroglobulin bound with the T3 and T4. So we can see that we broke it apart. We used a lysosome to do that. That's the job of our lysosome, to break things. And then we can secrete T3 and T4 into the bloodstream. So that's the basic pathway, and that's why we need all these things. So we're adding iodine in order to make the T3 and the T4 out of the thyroglobulin. We need a signal to tell us to take all this stuff out of the colloid and ultimately move it into the bloodstream. Okay. Now, there are some subtle differences between the T3 and the T4. They are both thyroid hormones, but your thyroid mostly makes T4. So it's our most abundant form produced. About 90% of the thyroid hormone that you're making. But T3 is actually the one that's more active at the target tissue, so the one that kind of works better. Okay. So what we usually do when we're thinking about thyroid hormones is the T4 gets converted into T3 at the target tissues to have that more active, more useful form. Another difference between the two is that the T4 does negative feedback a bit better. So we have long loop negative feedback from the T4. So we can see that going on here. So we have negative feedback on the anterior pituitary itself. We also have negative feedback going up to the hypothalamus, telling the hypothalamus we don't need to start this pathway at all. And then our target tissues for this, so we know, we're going to the liver, the kidneys, and some other cells. So what exactly is a thyroid hormone, right? So the thyroid hormone is lipophilic, so it's kind of like a steroid. This means it's really able to get into your cells, right? Because we have that hydrophobic layer in our membrane. It's only other hydrophobic things that can dissolve across. Thyroid hormone is one of those things. So thyroid hormone can get through your membranes, actually can get all the way to your nucleus. So it alters transcription of mRNA. So it's actually sort of interaction with your genes almost in order to change the machinery that's available in cells. So this is part of how it's having its regulatory effects on metabolism. It's also important in development. So if you don't have enough thyroid hormone during the development of an embryo, basically during the development of an embryo, thyroid hormone is also important for creating growth hormone, which is necessary for this process. So if there's not enough thyroid hormone, if you have this hypothyroidism during development, this causes something called cretinism. So in cretinism, the infant doesn't grow enough, and it also has issues with developing mental faculties, basically. So it has effects on both the brain and mental development and on physical development. So this is why it's important to check thyroid hormone levels, especially pregnant women. Now, aside from that, thyroid hormone generally has a calorogenic effect, which basically means we're going to be producing heat. The only really known environmental trigger for thyroid hormone is temperature. I'm sure there are other ones, but cold temperatures do trigger thyroid hormone release. So what thyroid hormone does ultimately through its effects on the mRNA transcription is it increases the rate at which our sodium potassium pumps work. It increases the number and the size of the mitochondria. It increases the enzymes we have for oxidative phosphorylation. It enhances our glycogenolysis by breaking down of glycogen, proteolysis, breaking down of protein, lipolysis, breaking down of fats. It promotes gluconeogenesis, so making more glucose, and synthesis of ketones. And it's also promoting the synthesis of our beta adrenergic receptors. So it's basically improving our response to circulating epinephrine. So most of these words should be vaguely familiar from our unit on metabolism. Hopefully you haven't totally erased that from your brains yet, because we're not going to be quizzing you directly on metabolism now. We're going to be talking about how we regulate metabolism, how we have different phases where we're doing different amounts of metabolism, different types of metabolism, and that's going to continue as we move into our discussion of muscle physiology, as we'll see that actually different muscle fiber types are going to be doing different things with their metabolism. So now's a good time to check back on your metabolism notes if you are at all fuzzy on that stuff. Okay. So thyroid hormone, basically, all of these things are talking about upregulating how active our metabolism is, and therefore how much heat we're producing, because we have that heat as a product of breaking down glucose. Okay. Brief side note about parathyroid hormone. So that's PTH. So parathyroid hormone or parathyroid glands are these tiny little things that sit on top of the thyroid. They're actually really important. They just have the one job to regulate calcium levels in the blood, but that is actually very important because our calcium levels are controlling those calcium gradients, which you've seen are important for our neurons, also be important for our muscle cells. So if you have surgery to remove any parts of your thyroid gland or something, sometimes they actually relocate these parathyroid glands. Sometimes they'll move one to your arm or something so that you still have this regulatory effect on calcium, even if they're messing with this area. Yeah, we had that calcitonin. Yeah. Okay. So next we're going to be talking about glucocorticoids, and we're going to be talking about more basically metabolism regulation as we talk about cortisol and start to tie some of these things together. Okay. So we're centering ourselves here on the adrenal glands first. We're thinking about all the different hormones that the adrenal glands can produce. So we refer to these different molecules that we're producing as adrenocorticoids. So that's just a class of molecule here. And they come in a couple different types. So we have our mineralocorticoids, mainly aldosterone, which is responsible for regulating our sodium and potassium levels. And based on our talks about the nervous system, we saw one of the reasons that's really important. When we talk about the kidneys, we'll see more reasons that's important. Really regulating all our ions and blood concentrations of things. It's important to have normal cell function because your cells rely on these consistent, steady levels of concentration gradients, basically. Your adrenal cortex also releases glucocorticoids, so that's where we're going to be spending most of our time, talking about cortisol, which is a glucocorticoid. And cortisol is responsible for regulating the body's response to stress. We often think about it as a stress hormone. And I don't want you to think about like cortisol so much as like stressing you out, but actually cortisol is important for making sure you can adapt to stress and function well to stress. So it's important and protective for you, actually. It's not a bad thing, even though sometimes it sounds like it. It's also involved in regulating the metabolism, as we'll see. The adrenal cortex also does release sex hormones, mainly androgens. So those are the more male sex hormones. So in males, this is usually kind of overridden by the amount coming from the gonads. But in females, this is the main place where your androgens are going to be coming from. So the sex hormones from the adrenal cortex partially regulate sexual function. We don't want to forget about the inside of the adrenal gland. So the adrenal medulla is that central part. Right, so a cortex is always the outer layer of something. The medulla really just means like the middle of something. Okay, so we remember that the medulla, or on the inside, was one of the places we had our sympathetic preganglionic nerves going, right? We were hooking up there with our chromatin cells, which are like modified postganglionic neurons, right? But they're smaller and they're just a little cell. And those are producing mainly epinephrine, so 80% epinephrine, and 20% norepinephrine, which is that neurotransmitter that our other parts of the sympathetic nervous system are usually releasing. There's also a little teeny tiny bit of dopamine coming from here, from the adrenal medulla. So the adrenal medulla is under neural control, in contrast to the adrenal cortex, with all those hormones we just talked about, which is mainly under the control of those tropic hormones coming from the anterior pituitary and not the thalamus. So for this unit, I highly recommend thinking about all sorts of opposites. We have lots of contrasts we're making in this unit. This is just kind of a side, right? But we're going to try and tell the difference between sympathetic, parasympathetic, preganglionic, postganglionic. Now we're talking about the adrenal cortex versus the adrenal medulla, and then we'll be talking about glucagon versus insulin. So it's a good idea to kind of highlight these things as you're thinking through this stuff to make sure that you can compare and contrast these different processes, structures, etc. Okay. So back to our glucocorticoids. So this is the main pathway, or one of the main pathways I want you to get from that section on the anterior pituitary, right? So our glucocorticoids start getting released in response to either stress or the circadian rhythm. So it's actually true that the circadian rhythm and cortisol are really linked. You release more cortisol in the morning, hopefully, than at night. So it kind of wakes you up, and then it's decreasing should put you to sleep. If you have trouble with sleeping, it may partially be due to different sort of schedule in cortisol release. Okay. So we have stress on the circadian rhythm coming in and interacting with the hypothalamus, which is where we get our first tropic hormone. So our CRH increases in response to stress or to signals from the circadian rhythm. And it goes through that portal system to the anterior pituitary, releasing our adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. This circulates into the blood, and it gets all the way down to your adrenal glands sitting on top of your kidney, specifically to the cortex, so to that outer shell. And then we release our cortisol. So this then has negative feedback effects on the anterior pituitary and on the hypothalamus, in addition to having effects on the target cells that we're going to see. So it's being regulated by what we refer to as the CRH-ACTH axis. So when we refer to something as an axis, which we'll see again in A&P2 when we get to kidneys, what we're basically talking about is kind of like a pathway of hormones. Okay, so we have this CRH-ACTH axis that's regulating how we release our cortisol. And then the cortisol is going to be partially responsible for mobilizing energy stores. It also suppresses your immune response. So if you ever hear about getting like cortisol shots to reduce inflammation, I herniated a disc over the weekend, so I'm hoping they will give me one. This is part of why that works, is that that's part of the action of the cortisol, is to kind of reduce the inflammation, possibly related to that regulation of stress, right? Too much chronic inflammation is really bad for your body, so that might be one of the ways it helps you adapt. So it's also sometimes used in post-surgery, for example, when you're trying to regulate how much you're feeling, how much inflammation you have there. So we have this thing we refer to as the stress response or general adaptation syndrome, which is just your stereotypical response to stress. It's what happens when you're stressed out or when your body encounters like a physical stressor. So when you're under stress, you release more cortisol, you release sympathetic activity, right? We know sympathetic, that's our fight or flight part of the autonomic nervous system. So we're going to be releasing norepinephrine from those neurons. We're going to be releasing epinephrine from our adrenal medulla. So third bullet point, epinephrine, also coming from the adrenal gland, right? Just the inside from those chromatin cells. We also release a couple of hormones. So we release ADH and angiotensin 2, and we'll talk about their functions in future units more. But in general, we have this fight or flight response that is responsible for preparing us to do something. So we're mobilizing our energy stores, right? So we're going to start using up things we've stored in the body so that we can produce more ATP, so that we could use our muscles to either run away or fight something. And we're maintaining the blood pressure also so we can keep active, right? That's going to be really important, basically. So because we have these regulatory effects and these sort of pathways of responses with cortisol and our glucocorticoid secretion, we also have problems if we have irregularities in secretion of these hormones. So in Cushing syndrome, this is a hypersecretion issue. So we're secreting too much cortisol, basically. So there are a bunch of symptoms, but one of the really important ones is hyperglycemia. So we're going to have a lot of sugar, basically, in the blood. And we'll also start to have wasting away of tissue. So we're going to have protein depletion as we're kind of mobilizing energy stores, right? We're going a little too far. When we talked about metabolism, we had that kind of end point where we talked about how if you run out of stuff, you can start to break down protein, actually break down skeletal muscle. So this is what causes that wasting away of the tissue in Cushing syndrome. On the opposite end of the spectrum, if we don't release enough, so if we have hyposecretion, it can result in something called Addison's disease. So Addison's disease is characterized by hypoglycemia, so not enough sugar, not enough glucose circulating in the blood. And this is going to result in a really poor tolerance for stress. because cortisol is so important in regulating that stress response. And this usually also affects aldosterone, which is going to be important in our renal system when we talk about that. So the ultimate effects of affecting the aldosterone are going to be that we're going to retain too much sodium, and we're going to have potassium secretion, and this can cause arrhythmias, so like heart problems. So neither of these are good. We want to have some cortisol, not too much. We want to have it at the right time. So next, we're going to be talking about the pancreas. So parts of the pancreas are also going to be involved in the metabolism. Part of the pancreas is involved with actually breaking down food. So we're starting with the exocrine pancreas. And the difference between exocrine and endocrine is that exocrine is mainly going to be like enzymes that go through a duct and go somewhere, versus endocrine specifically means we have a hormone going into the blood. So the exocrine pancreas, which we can see kind of everywhere, right? There's more of this exocrine pancreas, all these cells. They're secreting fluid and enzymes that go into the digestive tract. So they're going to go through our pancreatic duct, they're going to dump out in our intestines, and they're going to help us to break down food. But what we're mainly thinking about now, actually, is the endocrine pancreas. I'm going to flip back for a second so that we can see histologically what we're looking at. So we're focusing in that little cartoon on these islets of Langerhans. And this is where we're going to have the endocrine cells of our pancreas. We have a couple different types. So in the islets of Langerhans, here we see surrounding, we have all our exocrine cells. So they're actually, you can see them surrounding these ducts, basically. And on the inside here, the green and blue and purple, we have our endocrine cells. So the ones I really want you to focus in on, the most important ones, are going to be our alpha and beta cells. So our alpha cells, right? So alpha cells are these blue ones. The alpha cells are secreting glucagon. The beta cells, these green ones, are secreting insulin. This is going to be another set of opposites that you're going to be comparing and contrasting here. We're going to be talking about their roles in the absorptive and post-absorptive states. Since we're looking at the endocrine pancreas, I'm going to tell you that there are other things it's producing. So our delta cells are producing something called somatostatin, and our X cells are producing something called pancreatic polypeptide, but those aren't really our focus for now. What we want to know is about the alpha and beta cells and the glucagon and the insulin. Right. So as we start to talk about the role of the glucagon and the insulin, we're going to need some of our terms that we talked about way back when we were talking about metabolism. And one little aside that we mentioned a little bit at the beginning of this unit. So let's go ahead and remember which organ system really requires glucose for energy production and can only use glucose, pretty much. Take another couple seconds. Right. Okay. So we're actually thinking here about our nervous system. So as we talk through the next two concepts, the absorptive and post-absorptive state, I need to keep in mind that the brain specifically and the nervous system more generally really rely on glucose. They can't really use like proteins or anything else to make energy. They're really reliant on that classic glucose metabolism that we talked about. So that completely, stereotypical glucose metabolism, aerobic cellular respiration using oxygen. That's why your brain needs so much oxygen. And that's why we're going to end up saving glucose when we have it to feed our brain and our nerve cells. And since we're going back to metabolism, I want to bring back a couple of those terms we learned back then. And here's another compare and contrast. We had anabolism and catabolism. So anabolism and catabolism were two things we compared and contrasted before. Okay. Great. Yeah, anabolism is building larger molecules. So we're going to be taking subunits, taking monomers, pulling them together, which means that catabolism is breaking stuff apart. You can put a separate question on that since this is just an either or. Then we had a lot of words that started with glyco. So we're going to do a quick refresher on those. Say glyco or gluco. Seconds. Hopefully the easiest of the terms. Okay. Yeah, so glycogen synthesis. Synthesis is making something. So in glycogen synthesis, we're going to be making glycogen. I'll try another one. So glycogenolysis. Glycogenolysis. Look. Great. Yeah, so we're breaking down glycogen. So we have our glycogen. As we're talking about glycogen, and we have the lysis, like the lysosome, breaking stuff down. And I think we've got one more thing here. Yeah. So gluconeogenesis. Another long G word. Okay. Definitely running out of answers, right? Take a look. Yeah, so we're making new glucose. So gluco, that's our glucose. Neo means new. Genesis is creation. So we're creating new glucose with our gluconeogenesis. So these words are going to be showing up in our tables and flowcharts, which is why I just wanted a quick reminder of that. So what we're really focusing on as we talk about the absorptive and post-absorptive states and the roles of insulin and glucagon, so we're going to be thinking about how much glucose is circulating in the blood, how much glucose we're taking into our cells, and then whether we're building stuff up or we're breaking stuff down. Those are fundamentally like the concepts that we need to key in on. Right. So another compare and contrast, right? Is our absorptive state versus our post-absorptive state. So what we're really focusing on here is basically like what's happening in the short time after you eat a meal versus way later when you haven't eaten for a while. So during our absorptive state, so when you're absorbing things from the food you've eaten, you're going to be storing that energy in macromolecules. They're going to be sucking up glucose and various nutrients from your food, and you're going to store it because you don't really need a lot of energy as you're eating or right after you eat, right? In fact, sometimes you get like a little bit of a food coma, right? And during the post-absorptive state, so much later, you're going to need to continue to do all your normal body processes. And this is when we're going to start to use those energy stores. So we're going to mobilize them. We're going to move them around. We're going to start breaking down energy stores. And we're going to make our body work and do stuff. We're going to start with the absorptive state. So in the absorptive state, by definition, we have more energy input. And by input, I mean like into your body, right? So this is like the eating one. You're gonna have more energy input into your body than output. So like then used by your body. So you're absorbing nutrients from your food and you're storing them. You're not using very much energy. You're just kind of sitting around. During this time, glucose is going to be our primary energy source for our cells, right? Because we have a bunch of glucose around. And any excess, the excess other nutrients are going to be stored for later, right? We're saving them up. So our liver and muscle cells are going to be storing glycogen, which we know is just a bunch of glucose molecules kind of bound together. And our adipose tissue, so our fat, is going to be storing other nutrients, so other types of particles, right? We don't just eat pure sugar all the time. We're going to be eating, you know, some lipids. We're going to be eating some amino acids. We have fats and proteins. So we're going to be having our adipose tissue storing triglycerides. So that's the form we really store our fats in. So here we see kind of a flow chart of what different parts of the body are doing during this absorptive state. So we start out at the top. Right? You've eaten food recently, so it's moving through your gut. So we're gonna have broken it down through the digestive process, which we'll talk about in A&P 2. So for now, you know that we have a bunch of small nutrients that we've broken down in the gut. We're gonna start to pull them into our blood, right? We're absorbing them. That's why this is the absorptive state. So from the blood, we're gonna have glucose, right? So we're gonna have sugar, carbohydrates that we broke down. We're gonna have fatty acids, so any lipids, any fat we ate. We're gonna have amino acids from the proteins in our meal. So during this absorptive state, we have lots of glucose. So glucose can be used basically all around the body during this state. We don't have to save it for anywhere because we have lots. So glucose is gonna go to most of our body cells during the absorptive state, where it can be used to make energy pretty much wherever you are. The liver and the muscle cells can use the glucose, but they're also specifically able to store glucose as glycogen because they have the appropriate enzymes. So in the liver and muscle cells, we're going to see storage of our excess glucose as glycogen. Now, some of that glucose in the liver and also in the adipose tissue, so in the fat, is going to be used to get us some glycerol so that we can make triglycerides, our fats, right? So that we need that glycerol backbone. Glycerol is technically a carbohydrate, but overall a triglyceride is a lipid because we tack on those fatty acids. So we're taking the fatty acids and we're tacking them onto the glycerol to make triglycerides, which we hopefully remember are a really good energy store.
So the fat that we eat to the fat that we already have in our body and then create more fat.
Yeah, basically. The adipose tissue is made up of cells. So those are like fat cells, and then they contain these stores. And then that leaves us with our amino acids. So the protein go into the liver sometimes. So some amino acids can also be converted into fatty acids. So then they can also ultimately get stored as triglycerides. Yeah, so I guess in response to your question, so when we say fat, that's a little non-specific, right? Because we could either be talking about a fat cell, so adipose tissue, or we could be talking about a fat like the chemical, like a triglyceride. So that's why it doesn't actually say fat anywhere on this diagram, because we're just being quite specific here. The amino acids in muscle cells and in other cells that are not the liver are going to get turned into proteins, basically. So you could like build up your muscles during this time period. So that leads us to our post-absorptive state. So now some time has passed since we've eaten. So we've digested our food, we've absorbed those nutrients. Now we don't have any more energy coming into the body, right? So this is basically where you spend most of your time, right? So less energy is being put into the body than is getting out of the body, right? Because you still have, you know, your muscles helping your heart, have your heartbeat, your breathing, your thinking. You have a lot of parts of our body using energy. During the post-absorptive state, we're going to save our glucose for the nervous system. So the nervous system, and especially the brain, have to pretty much do aerobic cellular respiration, right? So they need that glucose and they need oxygen. They're going to be sparing that glucose for the nervous system, which means that our other tissues are going to have to use other stores of energy. So this is when those fatty acids and the triglycerides and maybe the proteins in your muscle are going to get used for energy by the tissues that can use them. So all of our stored nutrients are going to start to get broken down and mobilized, because this is why we were storing them, right? So that we could use them later. We have a bigger chart here, but fundamentally, this whole chart is just telling you how the different cells are doing that, how they're sparing things, how they're breaking stuff apart. So we're starting with our stored macromolecules. So we're going to see a bunch of catabolism, right? Catabolism, breaking stuff down here. So if we're looking at a muscle cell, we have that protein in there. So we could break down the proteins into their constituent parts, into their monomers, aka our amino acids, right? So then those amino acids will go into the blood. And this can be kind of tricky when you're looking at the blood. So think carefully about the direction of these arrows. So we are using up the amino acids in the muscle, which means they have to go somewhere. So they're increasing in the blood now. So they can go to any non-nervous tissue, because non-nervous tissue can use that for energy. Same kind of thing is happening with the triglycerides in our adipose tissue. So we're breaking apart the fatty acids from the glycerol. Those fatty acids go into the blood. So we see an increase in the fatty acids in the blood as we break down our triglycerides. And lots of our body tissue can use those for energy as well. Remember, we have a lot of energy stored in those carbon hydrogen bonds. So some of those fatty acids and the glycerol are going to be going, well, we'll talk about the glycerol next. So some of those fatty acids are going to the liver, where they're converted into ketones. So once we have ketones in the blood, ketones can directly be used for energy in non-nervous tissue, and a tiny bit in the nervous tissue. So your nervous tissue does really, really want glucose, but they can use ketones a little bit, right? So like people on the keto diet don't completely lose brain function, right? So you can use some ketones here. So in the liver, we're not just making those ketones, right? We had all this glycogen stored in the liver and in the muscle. So the glycogen can be broken down, turned into glucose, which pulls glucose into the blood. And then that's really the main source of energy for our nervous tissue. In the muscle cells, we can also break that apart. We do have a byproduct here that we make in the muscle cells often, but those byproducts can be turned into glucose, which increases glucose in the blood, therefore it can be used in the nervous tissue.
The simple sugar that our body can use, right? And the glycogen is the bigger molecule of the bunch of glucose. But then what was the glycerol?
Yep. The glycerol is just the backbone for the triglycerides, basically.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's easiest to think of it as like a part of that lipid. Yeah. So our hormonal regulation here of the absorptive and post-absorptive state coming from the insulin and the glucagon. So insulin is our hormone of our absorptive state. So while we're absorbing stuff and storing that excess energy, and glucagon is going to be our hormone of the post-absorptive state. So as we're mobilizing energy and sparing any glucose that we have for the nervous system. So we can think of them as antagonizing hormones because they're opposites, basically. There are some other regulators that are going in here. So our epinephrine, our sympathetic nervous system, right? So like our fight or flight sort of hormones and parts of the nervous system are also going to have an influence on whether we're in our fight or flight mode or our rest and digest mode, which we remember with the parasympathetics. So if you suddenly have a bunch of sympathetic nervous activity, you are not going to stay in your absorptive state, basically. Okay. So the insulin is coming from those beta cells in the islets of Langerhans in the endocrine pancreas that we looked at a couple minutes ago. And the action of the insulin is really just to trigger this anabolism to build up the energy stores. So we have a bunch of glucose coming into the body and other nutrients. We want to start to store things. So we're going to be storing glucose as glycogen. We're going to be storing fatty acid as triglyceride. And those are the main storage vehicles for our nutrients. So we could have a little bit in protein as well, but these are the two main places because these are the main places we're going to want to go use energy later. So it's promoting the use of glucose for storage molecules. And in order to store glucose, we're going to have to increase the rate at which glucose is taken out of the blood and into the cells. So as we think about glucose and where it is during the absorptive state and the post-absorptive state, we want to be very specific about whether we're talking about the blood or the cells that we're moving stuff into, because this can get a little mentally tricky if we're not specific. At the same time, since we're building stuff up, we're going to decrease catabolism, so we're not going to be breaking stuff down, right? So insulin secretion increases during the absorptive state. And there are a couple triggers for this, basically all a result of eating. So as you start to have more glucose, some more sugar in the plasma, so that's that extracellular fluid in your blood, right? You have all this glucose in the blood because your intestines have been pulling it out of your food. That's going to trigger the release of insulin. Same deal with amino acids. So those byproducts of breaking down our protein, that's going to be a trigger for insulin. That's going to tell your body that, it ate. Same thing with the parasympathetic nervous system. That's our rest and digest part of the nervous system. So if that's triggered, it's going to tell us, okay, we're in this rest and digest phase. It's time to store this stuff. And also this thing called glucose-dependent insulinotropic peptide, we're just going to call GIP, GIP. This is released basically by your intestine as you eat. So it's kind of a signal from your gut. The secretion of insulin, by contrast, during the post-absorptive state, you don't want to store stuff anymore. You don't want to do anabolism. You want to break stuff down. So you're going to decrease insulin secretion during the post-absorptive state. And you're going to have the opposite triggers. So you're going to have the sympathetic nervous system active and epinephrine from that adrenal medulla. So here is the chart that hopefully you glanced at as you were doing that big list of things on mastering A&P. But basically, our beta cells in the pancreas are increasing their insulin secretion as we see more glucose in the blood post-digestion, which tells most tissue to take in a bunch of glucose, take in a bunch of amino acid, start to make things, make protein, don't break down protein, pull in fatty acids and make our triglycerides. Don't be breaking down triglycerides. We're trying to store the excess energy. We don't want to do opposite processes at the same time. So we're making glycogen. We're not breaking down glycogen. Our liver is going to be making fatty acids and triglycerides. And this can be the, well, I don't know, this is the trickier thing for me to pay attention to anyway. We don't need to make new glucose basically because we have glucose in the blood during this phase. Okay, so we'll pick up next time with the post-absorptive state and we'll start talking about muscles as well